And when you think about how that First Amendment right of freedom of speech is being turned into a privilege that has to be purchased, and there is no better illustration of that than the last two state Supreme Court races. When you look at what happened last year and then again this year in the races for the highest court in our land here in Wisconsin, about $12 million was spent in those two elections. The thing is that out of that $12 million, almost $8 million of it wasn't raised or spent by the candidates themselves. It was raised and spent by four interest groups: Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the Coalition for America's Families, the Club for Growth, and the Greater Wisconsin Committee. Those four groups raised and spent 2/3 of the money. Those four groups did 90% of the television advertising. They turned the candidates into more or less bystanders in their own race. And WMC, of course, was the biggest spender of all. They spent $4 million in those two races. Fully 1/3 of all the money that was spent on those campaigns for Supreme Court was spent by that one single interest group. And WMC claims that it spent all that money to rid the court of what they call activist judges. Now, the irony there is surreal, because WMC owes its power to one of the greatest acts of judicial activism in American history. You've all heard about Brown versus Board of Education. You probably have heard of the Dred Scott decision. Not very many people have heard of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. But that 1886 case goes down in history, in my view, as one of the single most anti-democratic decisions ever rendered by the highest court in America. In Dred Scott, the Supreme Court ruled that people can be property. In Santa Clara County, the Supreme Court ruled that property can be a person. In 1886, the Supreme Court invented, out of thin air, out of whole cloth, they invented the concept of corporate personhood and extended the rights of citizens to corporations. And WMC owes its power to that act of judicial activism. And the amazing thing is that now, all these years later, WMC is exploiting the 19th century handiwork of activist judges to wage a war on what they claim is activist judges. Of course, activist judges, we all know, is code for the judge who doesn't rule the way they want them to. And what WMC plainly really wants is judges who will rule in favor of corporations over consumers in product liability cases, and will opt for businesses over individual citizens on tax cases. And WMC has already gotten a very handsome return on the millions that it has poured into these Supreme Court races, because in the Menasha Corporation tax case, the Supreme Court, on a 4-3 vote, ruled that computer software that these companies buy, and Menasha Corporation in particular purchased, shouldn't be subject to the state sales tax. It was a 4-3 decision. Annette Ziegler, for whom WMC spent $2 million to put on the state Supreme Court, was the deciding vote in that case and wrote the majority opinion, overturning a lower court that said that the corporation should have to pay sales tax on that computer software. That results in a $300 million tax break for corporations. And of course, what that means is that $300 million is going to have to come out of the pockets of all the rest of us to make up for that in one way or another. And that is the return on investment that WMC has already received, and of course, they're looking for much more. Judges are not supposed to belong to anyone. They are supposed to be accountable only to the law and the Constitution, but the last two state Supreme Court races show very clearly that wealthy interests aim to take control of state courts and then bend justice to serve their own purposes. Now, state Supreme Court elections have been poisoned. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But the thing that mystifies me, and Dave Zwiefel has stood up against this, bless his heart, but an amazing number of editorialists, an amazing number of opinion leaders around this state are coming to the conclusion that the only solution to these poisoned elections is to start appointing judges rather than electing them. And to that, I wonder, when elections have been poisoned, shouldn't we concentrate on getting rid of the poison instead of getting rid of the elections?